Hello, my name is Emily Steimel, and I am the Public Education Coordinator at the YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment. Today, the intent of this presentation is to provide professionals and members in our community with basic tools, information, skills, and resources to help us understand human trafficking and in turn support victims and survivors in our community. The YWCA Center for Safety and Empowerment, formerly known as the Battered Women's Task Force, provides free and confidential services to victims and survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, and stalking in Shawnee, Jackson, Wabunsee, and Brown counties in Kansas. All services that we provide at the Center for Safety and Empowerment, from our emergency safe shelter to our food and hygiene product pantry, counseling, and case management, are always going to come from an empowerment-based, survivor-centered, and trauma-informed approach. We also provide other options and services for survivors, such as some material or financial assistance when available, help with filing protection orders, responding to survivors at the hospital and law enforcement center, and more. Advocates are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year via our 24-hour helpline at 1-888-822-2983. We know that human trafficking is an underground crime, so it is difficult to measure, but we know the problem is real and we know the problem is big. Behind every situation of trafficking, there is a real person, a real human with a real story. However, I do think it's helpful to define human trafficking so that we are all on the same page. According to the Justice Department, human trafficking is any situation of exploitation that a person cannot refuse or leave because of force, fraud, or coercion. If the victim is under 18 years of age, no force, fraud, or coercion is necessary. Human trafficking is complex and notoriously underreported, but the more we know about what human trafficking is and how it works, the better we can recognize it, prevent it, and ensure we are keeping our communities safe. To really prevent human trafficking and sexual exploitation, we must take a step back and look at it as a part of a larger continuum of violence. This continuum includes forms of interpersonal violence such as childhood abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse, domestic violence, sexual assault, exploitation, and trafficking. As we talked about before, these forms of violence are rooted in exploitation of vulnerabilities for the abuser, batterer, or exploiter to have power and control. Looking closer at sex trafficking is rooted in a larger system of exploitation and oppression and is a threat to vulnerable adults and children nationwide. The United States Department of Justice declares it a crime to use force, fraud, or coercion to cause a person to engage in commercial sex. However, remember that any sex with a child under the age of 18 for the exchange of something of value is a crime, regardless if there is force, fraud, or coercion. In Kansas, there is no need for a third party. In the human trafficking scenario, we often imagine there is a pimp, a John, and a victim. Kansas does not require a third party, which means that it is not necessary to have all three entities, buyer, seller, and victim, in order to make an arrest or prosecute someone for committing this crime. If we truly want to abolish human trafficking, we must uproot the underlying issues that cause it. The entire global sex industry, including prostitution, pornography, and stripping, is a system where violence, abuse, exploitation, and gender inequality flourish. Oftentimes, stripping and pornography are a gateway or front for sex trafficking. We sat down with survivors at the Center for Safety and Empowerment to have a conversation about what the definitions of human trafficking meant to them. We talked a lot about words, what they meant, how different they were from person to person, and how the words impacted them. Whether it was one-on-one or in a group chat, we discussed how their words could better help impact people's understanding of their experience than just the definitions we share in a typical presentation. This survivor mentions being 12 the first time they were sold into sex trafficking. This is actually within the average age of entry in Kansas. Statistics have shown that the average age of entry into sex trafficking is 11 to 13 years old for boys and 14 to 16 years old for girls. The action means purpose AMP model from Polaris Project can be helpful in understanding the federal law. Human trafficking occurs when a perpetrator trafficker takes an action of inducing, recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, or soliciting, and then employs the means of force, physically making someone do something they do not want to do, physical assault, sexual assault, rape, physical confinement, isolation, and withdrawing of basic needs. Fraud, making false promises or pretending that something is different than what it really is, fake relationships or a fake job, or coercion, threats to life, safety, family members, or others, threats of deportation or arrest, debt bondage, withholding legal documents, psychological manipulation and abuse, and blackmail, for the purpose of compelling the victim to provide commercial sex acts or label services. At the minimum, one element from each column must be present to establish a potential situation of human trafficking. Once again, minors under the age of 18 induced into commercial sex are human trafficking victims regardless of the presence of force, fraud, or coercion. As part of our discussions, we had a conversation with clients about what force, fraud, and coercion meant and shared with them that we are often asked to define what this means to people who want to learn more about trafficking. Simply put, we looked at these definitions and asked them to explain what this looked like in their story. Survivors shared a common theme of endurance. The concept of supply and demand are fundamental building blocks in a capitalist economy. Supply represents how much of a particular product the market can offer, and demand refers to how much of a product is desired by potential buyers. In addition to desire for a product, demand hinges on both the potential buyer's ability and willingness to pay. On average, U.S. sex buyers spend more than $100 per transaction. When these concepts are applied to sex trafficking, those who are bought and sold for sex constitute the supply. Thus, sex trafficking reduces human beings, adults and children, into sexual commodities or objects. The supply marketplace encompasses any of the various modes by which sex trafficking is marketed: strip clubs, massage parlors, escort services, internet-based websites, pornography, brothels, as well as pimp-facilitated street-level prostitution, and more. Demand is the fulcrum on which all sex trafficking rests. Therefore, failure to combat demand guarantees not only the survival of sex trafficking, but also the creation of future generations of victims. Trafficking is not just a foreign issue. It happens all over the United States, in all 50 states. What we know about human trafficking is that it is a crime against a person. Therefore, it occurs wherever there are people, in our state, in our city, in our neighborhoods. We are always looking for statistics and numbers in this work, especially as it relates to the number of people affected by sexual exploitation and human trafficking. This is a closer look at the 2020 statistics from the National Human Trafficking Hotline. There were 51,667 total contacts. Out of those, 10,583 human trafficking cases were reported. 72% of those were sex trafficking, 83% involved U.S. citizens, 80% were female, and 24% involved children. Although it is important to understand the numbers and the extent to which these issues affect our communities, we also have to remember that human trafficking is extremely complex, difficult to measure, and notoriously underreported. These numbers are only a small fraction of the issue. What is vital to remember is that behind every number, behind every report of trafficking, there is a real person with a very real story, and we will be hearing some of those stories today. The National Human Trafficking Hotline reported 380 calls from Kansas in 2020, which resulted in 89 cases of human trafficking. People are always shocked to see the numbers when it comes to Kansas, like we are somehow exempt from the public health issue of sexual exploitation and trafficking. But we are not, because what we know about trafficking is that it happens wherever there are people. Kansas is unique because of its interstate system that runs east and west and north and south, making movement easy and the state accessible to traffickers. In fact, the director of the Paul and Lisa program, an organization that works with children in prostitution in New York City, said, quote, "Kansas is the state that New York City pimps love most," end quote. It is important to note that statistics from Shared Hope show that 1 in 8 trafficked children in New York are from Kansas. When talking about grooming, exploitation, and control, I think it is important that we first look at who the perpetrators and the traffickers are, because that plays a huge role in survivor stories of abuse and exploitation. We have heard all sorts of myths about trafficking and traffickers, from white passenger vans to movies like Taken to politicians in a pizza restaurant and trafficking children in overpriced cabinets. From social media warnings of zip ties and marked car windows to snatching children off the streets, packing them in shipping crates, and auctioning them off online, being sold to the highest bidder. Media, music, and movies oftentimes influence who we think a perpetrator of violence can be. However, contrary to popular misconceptions, trafficking rarely begins with being kidnapped by a stranger. Instead, most often, traffickers groom their victims by using love, romantic love, friendship, and family love, and trust to manipulate them into cooperating in their own abuse and exploitation. Because of these misconceptions about who traffickers are and what they look like, it can be hard for victims of trafficking who are being trafficked by someone they love and care about to identify as a victim or ask for help. According to the National Human Trafficking Hotline, pornography continues to be one of the top venues or industries for sex trafficking. Pornhub attracts 3.5 billion visits a month, more than Netflix, Yahoo, or Amazon, making it one of the top 10 most visited websites in the world. Of the 6.8 million new videos posted on the site each year, too many depict child abuse, revenge pornography, rape, spy cam videos, torture, extreme sexual violence, sex trafficking, and racist, misogynistic content. Because it's impossible to be sure whether a youth in a video is 14 or 18, or if the acts are consensual or non-consensual, neither Pornhub nor anyone else has a clear idea of how much content is illegal. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children receives 69.2 million reports of images, videos, and other content related to child sexual exploitation in 2019. Story after story, we hear of missing children and sexual assaults being uncovered on the site, re-traumatizing survivors and their loved ones for years to come. In the words of a survivor, "Pornhub became my trafficker. I'm still getting sold, even though I'm 5 years out of that life." Porn today is rife with rape, trafficking, exploitation, and sexual objectification. Research continues to uncover the harms of pornography on individual viewers, their relationship, and society as a whole. In this short video, we will hear from Dr. Karen Countryman Roseworm, discussing her expert perspective on the intersection between porn and sex trafficking. Dr. Countryman Roseworm has more than 2 decades of personal, professional practice and community-based research expertise in the anti-trafficking movement.
My name is Dr. Karen Countryman Roseworm. I'm a master level social worker and I have my PhD in psychology. I'm the founder and executive director of the Center for Combating Human Trafficking at Wichita State University, and our mission is ultimately to help build the capacity of our country, of this world, to respond to the issue of sexual exploitation. The focus of our work really began just because we were seeing so many of the runaway and homeless youth that we were working with, that they were being sexually exploited through what we now call domestic minor sex trafficking. We have worked for over 10 years to develop a domestic sex trafficking risk and resilience assessment, and that's gone through multiple layers of validation. We asked 258 young people the questions: number one, what do you feel put you at risk for sex trafficking? And then number two, what do you feel helped you get out of that experience of sex trafficking? what we were surprised to find is how there was a link between pornography and their risk for sex trafficking. Working with those who have been sex trafficked, we already knew that pornography was a part of the experience while they were being sex trafficked. What is most interesting, though, is to see that pornography is a common thread. So pornography is a risk factor, and then pornography, once they entered into a situation of sex trafficking and through force, fraud, or coercion, pornography was used as a means to normalize, to desensitize them to the sexual acts that they would experience, as well as pornography was oftentimes used as some sort of advertising for their sexual abuse. So through different modes of pornography, that they would be filmed and that they would be used and they would be advertised for the various acts that could be done to them, that they could be engaged in. And it was rape on camera. We really see the issue of trafficking on a continuum of violence, from pornography to sex trafficking. All these issues are connected, and again, it's on that continuum of violence. The images that occur within pornography actually encourage and promote and normalize that people want violence during sex. So it is rare to see a pornographic image, to watch any sort of pornographic video in this day and age that does not include violence. And so what it communicates is people like to get hit, people like to get hurt, and these faces, these images of terror become a norm. All these issues are connected, and again, it's on that continuum of violence. So pornography absolutely perpetuates abuse. It perpetuates human trafficking. It dehumanizes people, and we know that we're always looking for numbers in our country. What is the percentage of people that are affected by this or that, specifically sexual exploitation, human trafficking? And I think that understanding the numbers and the extent to which this affects our population is important, and yet at the same time, I believe that one person exploited is one too many.
The reality is that pornography distorts one's image of sex and love, power, and control, causing the detachment of the consumer's head, heart, and hands. Pornography increases the chances that one will act out their sexual fantasies on another, often another who has less power, less control. Many of the individuals photographed or filmed for the use of pornography have a history of sexual abuse. Many still, while being materialized for citizens across the world, are seemingly accepting such abuse and exploitation under the force, fraud, or coercion of a trafficker. Through the cycle of pornography-fueled physical and sexual abuse, pornography perpetuates further perpetration and trauma, and it is used to gain again and again to prime, promote, and perpetuate the perpetration of sex trafficking. Although it is true that human trafficking can happen to anyone in any community, the real story is that there are certain vulnerabilities traffickers look for to exploit in potential victims. Traffickers often look for people going through poverty and economic hardships, financial strain, housing instability and homelessness, a history of trauma, specifically sexual abuse, limited employment opportunities, personal substance use, mental illness, history of incarceration, and youth who are vulnerable due to running away or involvement in the child welfare and juvenile justice system. Traffickers then exploit these vulnerabilities and the victim's lack of social safety nets, while leveraging coercion, threats, intimidation, isolation, violence, and privilege to gain and maintain power and control over their victims and trapping them in a cycle of exploitation. We oftentimes hear statements like, "I can't believe she fell for that," or "if I were him, I would have told someone," or "I would have seen right through it," from community members and professionals who just do not understand the complex dynamics of trafficking. If you've ever been targeted by a trafficker, or even in an abusive or manipulative relationship of any kind, you may well think that nothing ever would convince you to have sex for money. The reality is, many of us would be surprised by what we could be manipulated into doing with the right combination of external factors in play. In the wrong hands, love oftentimes becomes a powerful tool of exploitation. In fact, it is the most commonly used weapon in sex trafficking operations. Sex traffickers frequently use the promise of love to lure vulnerable people into exploitation and abuse. Call them Romeo pimps or finesse pimps, or call them mom, dad, aunt, or uncle. Year after year, data from the National Human Trafficking Hotline shows that the majority of people in sex trafficking situations were recruited into trafficking by intimate partners or family members. During these survivor conversations, we started with the idea of looking in on grooming to better understand what grooming looked like through the eyes of the survivors. What we learned was that where love was needed, it was provided. Shelter, food, clothes, family, a need, it was freely given until it was not. At the Human Trafficking Day Center, we serve a hot lunch to the survivors every Friday and host what we call a lunch and chat. In this group chat, while we were talking about recruiting and grooming, the survivor made it known that they were not able to see the grooming through their experience, and that they now realized that the grooming had started when they were very little. As a group, we discussed how different it is to see this manipulation through getting needs met, until all of the danger and red flags are on high alert, when danger is the only thing left to see. As mentioned, traffickers are experts at finding those moments when people are vulnerable, of working the angles, of manipulating reality and leveraging fears. The process is called grooming. It is methodical, intentional, and it works. It is the most common way that people, adults and children, wind up in sex trafficking situations. Sex trafficking very rarely begins with a violent abduction or with a stranger involved at all. It begins with someone the victim knows and usually loves or trusts. Very rarely is trafficking the first thing to go wrong in someone's life. Many survivors have a history of sexual abuse, substance use, mental illness, physical neglect, domestic violence, incarceration, the death of immediate family members. Traffickers look for people who have emotional, material, or financial vulnerabilities or needs. They may scour specific locations, such as bus stations, shelters, or the streets, looking for someone without a safe place to stay, or who they may be able to charm with their flattery and attention. Or they may look more closely at the people in their own lives who are vulnerable. Social media has also provided traffickers with a convenient way to find and groom their victims. We were first introduced to the idea of street tags shortly after opening our day center. A survivor shared with their understanding about what they owed for any level of meeting their needs on the street, essentially what it costs to live on the streets, from squatting to couch surfing, showering to meals. This is where the idea of the day center was crafted, to help mitigate the ins and outs of remaining safe and the price tag that comes with that safety. Once a trafficker has identified their victim, they need to gain that person's trust. They'll pose as good listeners who care deeply as they learn more about what they can do to insinuate themselves more deeply in the victim's life. This is to make it appear that they are the perfect match, the answer to their dreams, the person they can count on. There is always a connection with someone who helped, cared, and loved them first. Someone who shared and created memories with them, that they had not had before. The trust was always built up before the breakdown. So when the person or the people you trust the most have done the unthinkable, what's left? Simply put, I have never had a survivor come to the day center and tell me that the first time they had met their trafficker, they made them do horrible things or hurt them. Survivors have taught us that traffickers expertly seek out people whose specific needs they can fill or pretend to fill. Depending on the individual victim, these needs could be physical, like a safe place to stay, or drugs, or a job to help them take care of themselves or their family, or something less tangible, like love, affection, and a sense of belonging or confidence. By fulfilling these needs, traffickers gain power, the power to provide and the threat, often unspoken, to take away what the person thinks they've gained. The trafficker lets them taste what it feels like to be loved or safe or taken care of. When survivors come to meet with us for services, they oftentimes come when they feel there is nothing else left. Power and control can leave survivors feeling emotionally bankrupt. The belief that they can come in for our services and owe nothing is sometimes unreal. We spent some time unpacking the dependency on the trafficker, how they were in control of the house, the food, the shower, the drugs. But at the same time, the survivor owed for all of it. There was a need for permission to use any of it and a fee once it was used. The survivor shared that they started out as a couple, but after devoting everything to them and believing they were the one, the relationship was reduced down to madness. There was nowhere else to go. They had nothing left. As the relationship grows, the trafficker slowly cuts the victim off from friends, family, loved ones, and their support system, strengthening the sense of dependency. This particular survivor had been sold by their partner to their drug dealer and then traded again. After their partner had been incarcerated, they would still deny the claims that they had been traded. Moved to a different town by the trafficker and without any family, it took the survivor 2 years to break away from the lies and manipulation. By isolating their victims, traffickers make it more difficult for them to reach out to others for help later on down the line. The way traffickers begin the process of exploiting their victims isn't always transparent. They may start out slowly by pushing the victim to do things they might be uncomfortable with, like asking them to have sex with a friend once or arranging a date for them as a way to make some quick money. But over time, the victim may be conditioned to believe that what they are being asked to do is normal, sometimes as a way to survive. They may even feel like they owe their trafficker for all they have done for them, or believe their trafficker when they say that the situation is just temporary or a way for them to reach their common goals, such as getting out of the sex trade and starting a family, or keeping the current abusive family together. Over time, the victim starts to think and believe that they are making these decisions on their own. Like other forms of interpersonal violence, human trafficking is rooted in power and control. After traffickers establish control over their victims, they have to carefully craft strategies to maintain it. These strategies differ depending on the person or the situation. In many cases, physical force is not necessary. The trafficker may keep their victim in the trafficking situation by continuing to isolate them, threatening them or their loved ones if they attempt to leave, controlling them through their addiction, or even manipulating their sense of self. Sometimes losing the idea or the illusion of love is enough to keep a person in a trafficking situation. As a result, victims become trapped and fear leaving for a multitude of reasons, including psychological trauma, shame, emotional attachment, concerns for safety, and physical threats to themselves or their family. Most often, traffickers will use an array of tactics, making it difficult to identify the various forms of abuse. Yet these tactics are collectively used to firmly establish a pattern of force, fraud, and coercion, intimidation, and control in the relationship. The purpose of the grooming process is for a trafficker to be able to gain full control over their victim and manipulate them into cooperating in their own exploitation. Recently, World Without Exploitation uncovered new and horrifying findings from individuals exposed to sex trafficking in different states across the United States. Sex trafficking often involves high levels of violent encounters, including threats with weapons, physical violence, and sexual assault. In fact, 92% of the women in these findings had reported being strangled, raped, shot, burned, beaten, stabbed, and punched. Many of the women reported that they were subjected to this brutality more than once, creating lifelong scars of psychological and physical trauma. Traffickers use rewards and punishments, fear and violence, along with kindness, affection, and care to create trauma bonds that make it hard for victims to sort through complex feelings and make a choice to leave, even if they are physically able to do so. These intense ups and downs in an unhealthy, abusive, and exploitative relationship, and the constant release of oxytocin and the withholding then sharp increase of dopamine can cause a survivor's brain to almost become addicted to the high highs and the low lows and associate this cycle with love. The fights, the breakups, the extreme events bring a survivor closer, even if it comes at the expense of their own wants, needs, mental health, and safety. Trauma bonding, in addition to many other factors, is why survivors stay with their abuser or trafficker and why they do not leave. Sometimes, losing that idea of love is enough to keep a person in the trafficking situation. If we do not understand how trauma can impact a person's brain, we will not understand the victim's behavior, which can cause us to jump to incorrect, harmful, and damaging conclusions. We have an open dialogue about safety planning with survivors because it is constantly changing. Not only because every person is different, but because the game is always changing. Think a safety plan for every seller, buyer, and supposed family member one survivor may have crossed paths with. Sometimes a safety plan is in depth with relocation and go bags, all the way to as basic as having food to get by for the next couple of days so they don't owe anyone for eating. Although it is true that human trafficking can happen to anyone in any community, the real story is that there are societal, communal, relational, and individual circumstances that can leave someone vulnerable to trafficking and exploitation. Poverty and economic hardships, financial strain, housing instability and homelessness, generational trauma, a history of abuse, specifically sexual abuse, limited employment opportunities, mental illness, personal substance use, a history of incarceration, and other factors and inequities create community-wide vulnerabilities. Traffickers recognize and exploit these vulnerabilities and the victim's lack of social safety nets, while leveraging coercion, threats, intimidation, isolation, violence, and privilege to gain and maintain power and control over their victims and trapping them in a cycle of exploitation. Research shows that when a person experiences childhood abuse or domestic violence, they are at an increased risk for sexual assault and/or sexual exploitation. Effective prevention programming is grounded in research and involves decreasing risk while increasing protection. A list of research-identified risk and protective factors for abuse, exploitation, and trafficking from the Center for Combating Human Trafficking are listed here. With these risks and protective factors in mind, the impact of relationships with safe people cannot be overstated. Abusers and traffickers commonly pretend to care in order to groom or recruit vulnerable youth and adults. Individuals, especially youth, are less likely to fall prey to these tactics when they have caring, supportive people around them. Supportive people, such as mentors, offer additional protection to vulnerable individuals, not only because they provide healthy and positive attention and genuine care, but they also assist with psychosocial development, helping to build critical skills such as self-regulation, self-care, and planning for the future. As a result, this helps individuals to create a vision for the future that might not have seemed possible before. For girls, one of the main predictors of entry into the juvenile justice system is sexual abuse. The abuse to prison pipeline is a term used to describe the pathways of abuse that lead girls, especially girls of color, into the justice system as a direct result of their trauma. A particularly glaring example is when girls are routinely arrested for prostitution, punished as perpetrators rather than served and supported as victim survivors of human trafficking. Public support too often stops when survivors are on the other side of the justice system. Because incarceration further destabilizes already marginalized and vulnerable communities, it ultimately perpetuates the conditions in which trauma compounds, re-traumatizing survivors and fueling the cycle of victimization, abuse, and incarceration. People at risk of losing their housing or those without safe and stable housing are also vulnerable to trafficking. When someone is struggling to pay for rent or mortgage, it looms as a big bill with big consequences. Housing instability is not only a vulnerability for being trafficked initially, but it's also a massive vulnerability for those who have already been trafficked to experience re-victimization. Because if there is a financial issue and hardships related to housing, a person may return to an exploitative situation to get money fast or connect with their past trafficker to assist them financially. People who are experiencing homelessness or displacement are extremely vulnerable to trafficking. Oftentimes, survivors of trafficking become homeless due to poverty, fleeing domestic violence and abuse, being kicked out, being abandoned, or immigrating. When a survivor does not have a safe place to stay, traffickers will offer shelter in exchange for sex. Maybe not initially, but eventually. This is called survival sex. Due to the other vulnerabilities someone in homelessness faces, many traffickers will target homeless shelters and social service agencies for the unsheltered population as recruitment grounds. Hunger and food insecurity is also a vulnerability that traffickers often use to target and exploit victims. Traffickers may promise food resources for a person or their family, or groom a person who is living with food insecurity by treating them to meals. The stress and toll of living with chronic hunger and malnutrition leaves a person less able to make choices that would help keep them safe. For survivors, it is the constant thought of, what can I carry with me? Where can I keep it? How can I cook this? It is not that the bread and cheese cannot be eaten, but how can you carry bread and cheese with you from place to place? Or the survivor who is expected to bring a food box or something similar in order to couch surf for a night or two. So the survivor who left with a food bag on Monday is now back in need again on Wednesday. Economic pressure caused by unemployment or underemployment on a person or in a family can be significant vulnerability traffickers prey upon because it impacts ability to provide and meet basic needs and impacts sense of purpose and identity. Lack of basic needs, pressure to provide, and the emotional impact of both of these can have ripple effects that traffickers can use to exploit. For those survivors with a history of sex trafficking, unemployment or underemployment can increase their risk for re-victimization, as they may look for fast money to help alleviate the pressures of their current situation. Additionally, for those looking for work, false or misleading job offers are also a common recruitment ply for trafficking. During recent chats with survivors, we talked about the one time they could think back to where things could have begun. Many survivors were able to come to a moment where substance use and addiction was the catalyst to their trauma. This particular survivor shared the depth her trafficker went to make her perfect for making him more money, no matter the cost to her physical health, as she became more and more addicted to crack. When reflecting on the moment the survivor shared this part of their story, I am able to recall when several others could relate to what she said. That no matter their situation, arrest, emergency room visit, police interaction, crisis, mental health, each person was able to connect to that moment of exhaustion. That no matter the trafficking that had led them to that moment, they were exhausted, and rarely was the question asked about how they got there. No, why have you been arrested 3 times this month? No, this is the 4th time you have been to the emergency room. This is really where you can step in, ask the questions, start the conversation, and help save a life. There are more people than ever who are vulnerable to the lure of traffickers promising love, safety, shelter, and economic stability. Unfortunately, past histories of abuse, discrimination, rejection, violence, financial instability, and homelessness are some of the key reasons why the LGBTQ+ community can be especially vulnerable and disproportionately affected by human trafficking. However, stigma, fear, discrimination, prejudice, violence, and poor relationships with law enforcement also present barriers for LGBTQ plus trafficking victims and survivors to reach out for help and support. LGBTQ plus people of color face a heightened vulnerability that arises from the intersection of homophobia, transphobia, and racism, making them especially susceptible to traffickers. When people do not get the services that they need, they are more likely to return to their trafficker. We owe it to our community to ensure vulnerable populations, especially homeless LGBTQ plus youth and trans women of color, have access to specialized services that are inclusive and empowering. We know that human trafficking does not happen in a vacuum. It is a compounded result of a range of injustices and inequities in our society and our economy, far more than what we have mentioned today. People of color, indigenous communities, immigrants, and the LGBTQ plus community are disproportionately victimized because they are disproportionately affected by these social and economic vulnerabilities. To prevent trafficking at the root of the problem means addressing these underlying systems, the inequities and injustices that make people vulnerable in the first place. It means ensuring survivors can find safety and the supports and opportunities they deserve to rebuild their lives. Because human trafficking does not happen in a vacuum, our response can't either. As many communities introduce bills to decriminalize the sex trade, the voices of survivors are far too often silenced and forgotten. Much of the legislation across the world seeks to fully decriminalize the commercial sex trade, which ignores the trauma that survivors experience, failing to protect those most vulnerable and continuing the cycle of abuse. As we continue to look at research-based prevention models, the equality model prioritizes the health, well-being, and economic opportunity of survivors by working to close on-ramps into exploitation, such as lack of employment, housing instability, and substance use, while opening off-ramps, such as investing in treatment for substance use and mental health, transitional housing, and job opportunities. By providing avenues for exiting the sex industry with much needed, comprehensive, specialized services, while maintaining prohibitions against the act of purchasing sex acts, demand for the sex trade will decrease. We can make strides to all but eliminate the instances of long-term trauma and harm against individuals in trafficking and decrease demand from buyers and exploiters by implementing partial decriminalization. Under this approach, individuals who are bought and sold are protected from arrest and prosecution, but not their buyers or exploiters. This way forward provides a better way where survivors are heard, centered, and protected. Under this approach, demand from buyers and exploiters is decreased, survivors and victims are protected from arrest, prosecution, and stigmatization, and buyers and exploiters are held accountable for preying on vulnerable individuals and profiting from their trauma. Awareness means that we have to have purposeful action. Victim-centered, survivor-led anti-trafficking work is critical. Far too often in the anti-trafficking movement, survivors are not given a seat at the table. By failing to meaningfully engage survivors in this work, we shut out the true experts. We must rise, unite, support, and elevate the voices of survivors beyond sharing the details of their exploitation. We must honor the lived experiences of survivors and overcomers and engage them in meaningful ways. The criminalization of victims is harmful. Many of the laws implemented in our country over the last 10 years have had unintended negative consequences. All over the United States, there have been more and more cases of survivors being charged with crimes that occurred as a direct result of their exploitation. Instead of receiving much needed support, survivors are often treated as criminals. This criminalization continues to occur because most remain uneducated about the realities of trafficking and the intense trauma victims experience while being exploited. We must all do what we can to offer justice and hope. Anti-trafficking responses must be relational individualized, and holistic. Overall, there is far too great of an emphasis placed on the rescue of trafficking victims, with very little thought as to what happens next. The road out of exploitation is long and difficult. Growth, progress, and healing take time, and backsliding still occurs. Ultimately, survivors need to be connected to services that will address needs in every dimension of their life: housing, education, job skills, money management, mental health, emotional health, and physical health. Building safe relationships with human trafficking survivors makes a difference. At the end of the day, services don't change people. Relationships change people. Oftentimes, survivors of trafficking have had negative experiences with relationships. They may have been let down, ignored, or even exploited by those closest to them. The building of safe relationships can be restorative, offering opportunities for growth and healing. Everyone has a role to play in the anti-trafficking movement. While each of us have different gifts and abilities, we are all needed in this work. We cannot do it alone by operating in our own distinct silos. We must engage and rely on our partners, volunteers, and supporters. Ultimately, it is survivors who suffer when we are territorial or ego-driven. The Polaris Project-operated National Human Trafficking Hotline is a national 24-hour confidential anti-trafficking crisis and tip line and a resource, referral, and response center serving the United States. The National Human Trafficking Hotline provides human trafficking victims and survivors with access to critical support and services to get help and stay safe. It also equips the anti-trafficking community with the tools to combat all forms of trafficking and provides a resource for data regarding national human trafficking trends based on hotline calls received. The National Human Trafficking Hotline can be reached by call, text, and live chat. Thank you so much for tuning in to this session of the overview of human trafficking. The truth is that human trafficking is not a new phenomenon, but caring about it is. The fact that we are seeing trafficking and talking about it is a huge step forward towards progress. And the fact is, everyone has a role to play in the anti-trafficking movement. Elevating our different abilities and harnessing our collective feelings of determination and defiant hope will move us closer towards ending trafficking and exploitation. We cannot do this work alone. We must engage in and rely on the efforts of our partners, allies, volunteers, and supporters to assist in furthering the paradigm shift regarding commercial sexual exploitation. Additionally, it is together that we work to create a web of services that wrap around a survivor as they journey to achieving sustainable health and prosperity. This is how we will create lasting and meaningful change. If you or someone you know is being forced to engage in any activity, or you just have questions and want to talk, advocates are available 24/7 via our free and confidential helpline at 1-888-822-2983. To learn more about our services and to connect with our mission, please visit our website at www.ywcans.org or our social media pages.